No, you don't belong here." The words sliced through the crowded chamber like a blade, sharp enough to silence hundreds of voices in an instant. The hearing room had been buzzing moments earlier, cameras clicking, reporters whispering, staffers shifting papers under the harsh white lights. Outside, protesters chanted. Inside, history was about to unfold. At the center of the room sat the woman everyone had come to see, calm, still unshaken. Dr. Elena Morales, immigrant, constitutional scholar, and the first in her family to ever stand before Congress, folded her hands on the table as if the chaos around her didn't exist. Across from her leaned Senator Richard Hawley, powerful, smiling, said, and he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You built your career criticizing this country," he continued, his tone cool but edged with contempt. "So tell us plainly, Dr. Morales, why should someone who wasn't even born here be trusted to lecture Americans about their own constitution?" A ripple moved through the room, then came the gasps. Some reporters froze mid-no, others looked up sharply. On the public benches, a young woman shook her head, whispering, "Did he really just say that?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. It wasn't policy anymore, it was identity. It was belonging, and everyone understood exactly what had just happened. All eyes turned back to Dr. Morales. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't react, or she simply took a slow breath, the kind that comes from years of being underestimated, dismissed, and told to prove your place in rooms like this. Senator Hawley leaned back, confident, almost satisfied, as if the moment itself had already won him the narrative of the silence he expected. It wasn't weakness, it was restraint, because what he didn't realize, what no one in that room realized yet, was that this question wasn't just an attack, it was the spark, and the response that was coming would travel far beyond that chamber. But this explosive moment didn't come out of nowhere. What led to this confrontation would reveal a much bigger story. Long before the cameras turned toward her, Dr. Elena Morales had spent her life doing the quiet work of belonging. She arrived in this country at the age of 9, holding her mother's hand in a single suitcase that carried everything they owned. They settled in a one-bedroom apartment above a grocery store, where English was learned after school, bills were counted at the kitchen table, and every opportunity was treated like something fragile, something that could disappear if you didn't work twice as hard to earn it. Elena did top of her class, scholarships, law school, then constitutional law, not because it was easy, but because she believed deeply in the promise written into the country that had taken her in. Her students knew her as demanding but fair. Her colleagues described her as relentless about facts, careful with words, and unwavering about one principle: the Constitution belongs to everyone it protects. Over 2 decades, she testified in courtrooms, advised policymakers from both parties, and built a reputation that even her critics admitted was grounded in scholarship, not ideology. But credibility doesn't protect you from becoming a symbol, and in the months leading up to the hearing, that's exactly what she had become. Clips of her lectures began circulating online, carefully edited, stripped of context. Commentators questioned her loyalty. Talk shows debated whether foreign-born academics should have influence over national policy. Her name was no longer just a name. It was a talking point at the center of that narrative stood Senator Richard Hawley, a veteran of political battles. Hawley had built his career on sharp sound bites and cultural flashpoints. His supporters admired his bluntness. His critics called it something else. Calculated outrage. Poll numbers showed his base responded strongest when the conversation shifted from policy to identity, from law to who deserved a voice in shaping it. And as the hearing approached, his messaging grew more pointed. "This isn't about expertise," he told a rally days before. "It's about who speaks for America." The line spread quickly. So did the tension. Advocacy groups, mobilized in support of Dr. Morales' opponents, demanded the committee reject her testimony. Social media turned the upcoming hearing into a referendum on something much larger than constitutional interpretation. It wasn't just about legal theory anymore. It was about belonging, authority, ownership of the national story behind the scenes. Staffers warned that the exchange could turn confrontational. Journalists prepared for a headline moment. Even some committee members privately wondered whether the hearing would stay focused on policy at all. By the morning she walked into that chamber, the lines weren't just drawn, they were hardened to narratives, to visions, to definitions of who gets to speak and who gets questioned for daring to. And when the two finally faced each other, no one expected the situation to spiral this far. The silence after Senator Hale's question stretched, just long enough to make the tension visible. Every camera in the room tightened its focus. Dr. Elena Morales lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Senator," she began, her voice steady, almost quiet, "I lecture about the Constitution because I've spent my life studying it, teaching it, and defending the rights it guarantees to every person under its protection." Hawley leaned forward, the corner of his mouth tightening. "That's not what I asked," he replied. "I asked why someone who chose this country later in life believes they understand it better than the people who were born into it." A murmur moved through the audience. Reporters exchanged glances. One producer in the back whispered, "This is going to blow up." Dr. Morales kept her hands folded. "I don't believe I understand it better," she said. "I believe I understand what it means to depend on it." Harley didn't pause you saying immigrants appreciate America more than Americans do. The tone wasn't curious. It was bait. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, on social media feeds already streaming the hearing live. Comments began to surge. Dr. Morales answered carefully, "I'm saying that the Constitution was written to protect people equally, not based on where they were born, but on the principles this country chose to stand for." Haley sat back, then shook his head slowly. "That sounds like theory," he said. "But here's the reality. Millions of Americans feel their country is changing faster than they recognize. And now they're being told what their laws mean by someone who wasn't even raised in their culture." The words landed heavier this time. A few gasps, a few nods. The framing was no longer subtle. Dr. Morales took a breath. "Senator, with respect, I was raised in this country's public schools. I pledged allegiance every morning. I studied its history, its struggles, its failures, and its promises. My culture is the Constitution." For the first time, applause broke out quickly, silenced by the committee chair's gavel. Hale's expression hardened. "So you believe your interpretation represents the real America?" "I believe the Constitution represents the real America," she answered. The exchange was no longer an interview, it was a contest. Haley glanced toward the cameras, then back at her. "Let me ask you directly," he said. "Do you think people like you should have the authority to reshape the values of this nation?" The room went still again. The question wasn't about law anymore, it was about legitimacy. Pressure mounted visibly now. Producers signaling, reporters typing faster, phones lighting up across the chamber as clips began circulating in real time. "Dr. Morales didn't rush a response, Senator," she said, her voice calm but firmer than before. "No one person reshapes this nation. That responsibility belongs to its people. All of them." Haley gave a small, confident smile, as if the moment had confirmed exactly the confrontation he wanted. But what he didn't realize was that the exchange had already crossed a line, one the public was about to notice. Because what happened next didn't just escalate the conflict, it changed the entire narrative. Within minutes of the exchange, the clip was everywhere. First on live feeds, then on news alerts, then across every major social platform. Cut into sharp, shareable moments, Senator Hale's question, the pause, the words, "Someone who wasn't even born here." By the end of the hour, the hearing wasn't just a policy discussion, it was a national argument. Cable news banners flashed competing narratives. Immigrant scholar challenges senator on Constitution. Law professor dodges questions about American values. Panelists talked over one another. Commentators dissected tone, posture, word choice, not just what was said, but what it meant. Online, the divide hardened even faster. Supporters praised Dr. Morales' composure, calling her response dignified, powerful, necessary. Critics accused her of elitism, of arrogance, of representing a class of experts disconnected from real Americans. The same clip traveled through two completely different realities. Hashtags trended on both sides, so did edited versions of her past lectures, pulled from years earlier and stripped of context. A sentence about constitutional reform became "She wants to rewrite America." A classroom discussion about civil liberties became "She thinks the system is broken." The narrative wasn't forming anymore, it was being shaped by afternoon. Political figures began weighing in. Some praised her credentials and courage, others echoed Hale's framing, questioning whether someone with her background should influence national policy at all. The pressure closed in from every direction. Inside her office, Dr. Morales watched the coverage quietly, her phone vibrating non-stop. Interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages that were harder to read. Some were grateful, others were not. Emails questioning her loyalty, posts demanding she'll go back where she came from, strangers debating her identity as if it were a public issue. Her university released a statement supporting academic freedom. Advocacy groups offered legal assistance. Colleagues checked in, but support didn't quiet the noise. By evening, pundits were asking a new question. Had the hearing gone too far, or had she? For the first time since walking into that chamber, the weight showed, not publicly, not on camera, but alone. Late that night, the certainty that had carried her through decades of work felt thinner than it had that morning. Because this wasn't just criticism of her ideas. It was a challenge to a place, to a voice, to whether everything she had built could be reduced to where she was born. And the loudest voices weren't arguing about constitutional law anymore, they were arguing about whether she belonged in the conversation at all. By the next morning, producers were asking if she would respond. Advisors suggested staying quiet. Friends warned that anything she said could make things worse. For the first time, silence felt safer than speaking, and for a moment it seemed like the storm might do what the hearing codes wear her down, push her out, make the story end there. But just when it seemed the pressure might break them, the turning point arrives. The next morning, Dr. Elena Morales walked into the university auditorium before the cameras were even fully set. No dramatic entrance, no prepared crowd, just a podium, a quiet room, and a statement she had decided could no longer wait. Producers expected a defensive response. Critics expected clarification. Supporters hoped for reassurance. What they got instead was something else entirely. She began without notes yesterday. She said calmly a question was asked about whether someone like me belongs in conversations about this country. The room fell still. I've spent my career teaching the Constitution, she continued. But today, I want to talk about something simpler, what belonging actually looks like. Behind her, a screen lit up, not with political arguments, with records, naturalization papers dated 27 years earlier, tax records showing decades of public service income, a timeline of court cases she had worked on, including several defending veterans, benefits and voting access in rural districts that overwhelmingly supported Senator Haley. Murmurs moved through the room. This is my record, she said. Not my birthplace, my record. The screen changed again. Images of her students, first-generation college graduates, military families, small-town scholarship recipients. I don't teach ideology, she said. I teach the framework that protects every one of them regardless of where they come from, who they vote for, or what they believe. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Then she paused. And since my background has become part of the conversation, she added, there's something else worth clarifying. Another document appeared, her oath of citizenship. Below it, highlighted text from the Constitution's own history, showing that 6 of the nation's early founders were themselves foreign-born. The room went silent, not the tense silence of confrontation. The heavier kind. Recognition. For most of our history, she said, this country has not asked where commitment begins. It has asked whether commitment exists. Phones were already recording. Clips were already spreading. But she wasn't finished. I did not come here to reshape America, she said. I came here because America reshaped my life. The Constitution did that. Opportunity did that. The idea that effort matters more than origin did that. She looked directly into the cameras. So the question is not whether I belong in this conversation. The question is whether we still believe the Constitution belongs to everyone it protects. No applause at first, just stillness. Then, slowly, the sound began to build across the country. The narrative was already shifting, and within hours, the reaction spread across the country and nothing would be the same. The clip didn't just spread, it surged within an hour. Excerpts from Dr. Morales' statement were everywhere. The documents behind her, the calm delivery, the final line about belonging in the Constitution. But this time, the reaction was different. The conversation wasn't centered on where she was born, it was centered on what she had done. The full video began trending across multiple platforms. Hashtags that had once carried criticism were overtaken by a new message. Record over origin. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Veterans groups posted the cases she had worked on. Former students uploaded their own videos, some standing outside courthouses, others sitting in dorm rooms, telling stories about how her classes had helped them understand their rights, their responsibilities, and their place in the country. One message shared thousands of times read, "She didn't just teach the Constitution, she taught us that it includes us." Cable news shifted tone almost overnight. Panels that had questioned her credibility were now replaying the full context of her work. Legal analysts walked viewers through her case history. Commentators who had once debated her identity began discussing her impact. Even some political voices who had stayed silent began to speak. Not about controversy, about contribution. The narrative had moved from suspicion to substance, from background to record. By evening, the auditorium speech had been viewed millions of times. Universities requested permission to include it in civic education programs. Non-profit organizations asked her to speak about public service and constitutional literacy. But the strongest reaction didn't come from institutions. It came from ordinary people. A naturalized citizen posted a photo of their own oath ceremony with the caption, "This is what belonging looks like." A small-town mayor wrote, "She defended voting access in our county when no one else paid attention." Parents sent messages saying they showed the video to their children, not as a political moment, but as a lesson in dignity. The story was no longer about a hearing, or a senator, or even a single exchange. Dr. Elena Morales had become something larger, not just a scholar under scrutiny, but a symbol of quiet persistence, of contribution without recognition, of the millions of stories that rarely make headlines. And as the public conversation turned toward inspiration instead of accusation, one reality became impossible to ignore. But while the hero's message was spreading, the consequences for the other side were just beginning. Public attention had shifted. Senator Haley, once confident, faced questions he hadn't anticipated. Fact-checkers dissected his previous statements. Analysts replayed clips of his rallies and interviews. His rhetoric, previously celebrated by his base, now looked performative and divisive. Editorial boards called for accountability. Social media hashtags that had supported him flipped tone, exposing hypocrisy or misrepresentation. Even colleagues in Congress quietly questioned whether his approach had crossed a line. Some of Hale's allies issued partial apologies. Others remained defensive, but the narrative had moved beyond them. Polling showed his favorability dropping. Invitations to speak at events were rescinded. Committees debated whether his methods undermined trust in public discourse. The power dynamic had shifted. The man who once commanded the conversation was now reacting to it. Criticism wasn't limited to politics. Journalists highlighted the contrast between his rhetoric and documented facts. Reports emphasized Dr. Morales' years of service, painting him as the one out of step for the first time. The room where the confrontation began felt different. The villain's authority had been undermined, publicly, methodically, and irreversibly. Yet the biggest impact of the story wasn't political, it was personal. The headlines had faded, but the story didn't end. In living rooms, classrooms, and small-town cafes, people replayed Dr. Morales' words not to debate policy, but to reflect on what belonging really meant. Immigrants saw themselves in her calm authority. Students shared clips with teachers, inspired by the reminder that diligence and integrity could overcome doubt. Families posted messages online about how they showed the video to children, explaining that courage and preparation matter more than origin. Letters arrived at her office from veterans she had helped, parents she had guided, and strangers who simply felt seen. One email read, "You reminded me I belong here, that my story matters." Another, from a young college student, said, "I've been silenced in class for speaking up about my background. Watching you respond reminded me I have a voice." Dr. Morales did not seek accolades. She answered each message with humility, emphasizing the shared responsibility to protect rights and dignity for everyone. Her focus was always on the people, not the politics. Community leaders echoed the sentiment. Local newspapers ran editorials praising the integrity she showed. Teachers incorporated her example into lessons about civic engagement. Even former critics began acknowledging the larger truth. The story had transcended controversy and become a lesson in empathy, identity, and perseverance. In those quiet, personal moments, the impact of the confrontation crystallized. This was not just a political spectacle. It was a human story about courage, belonging, and the quiet power of doing what's right. And in the end, this moment left behind a lesson far bigger than the headlines. In the end, the story wasn't about a single hearing, a single clash, or even a single person. It was about the principles that hold a nation together: courage, integrity, and the quiet insistence that every voice matters. Dr. Alina Morales' calm, unwavering presence had forced a nation to reckon with what it truly values. Noise, anger, and performative authority had been exposed for what they were: distractions from truth. The headlines faded, but the lesson endured. The contrast was undeniable. One side relied on theatrics, assumptions, and power. The other relied on preparation, dignity, and conviction. And it was the latter that left a mark, not in politics, but in hearts. Because sometimes, it isn't the loudest or the most aggressive voice that shapes history. It's the one that stands firm, guided by principle, and reminds everyone what the promise of a nation was always meant to be. In those quiet moments of reflection, the country saw itself more clearly and the real story became impossible to forget. What would you have done in that moment, Tan? Could you have stayed as calm as Dr. Morales?